to bring a skill that shows that that's happening. I think, again, as I said, if you want to move people along, we need to do a good job of messaging these things to make it very, very politically painful for these people to cast the votes they're casting because their constituents are no longer agreeing with them. We need to change that conversation in there because elected officials will move where that's at. And I'm not even saying that's a pejorative. So it's our job to build that out. It's our job, and especially in these greater Minnesota areas where there isn't a lot of representation. I mean, think about it in the United States Congress. 10 rural Democrats left in the entire country. If you look at a map of that red-blue map, it is blue from the edge of my district by Sioux Falls all the way to Washington State. It is red all the way across there. We're not going to just try and think election strategy to get that back. We have to reach the center of people's lives so they say these people are with us. And here in Minnesota, Peggy and I are trying to make the case that these policies are best for the state of Minnesota and it's best for you to come on board. And we have to prove that. I mean, that's our job.
Representative Flanagan, I mean, you've been in the Minnesota legislature. You know how easy it is to work with Republicans as a Democrat. So, I mean, I'm wondering if you can speak to that to some degree.
I can. Thanks for asking, Tate. I appreciate it. Here's the deal. I think the thing that doesn't get covered, right, is when we actually agree. It is a lot more exciting to talk about when we're duking it out. And listen, in the final hours of session, it gets a little rough, right? People are a little punchy, and we have some tough conversations. But here's what I'll say. There's also opportunities, right, to get Republican co-authors. I have a culturally competent doula bill, right, where we're offering culturally competent care for prenatal care, for women of color, for Indigenous women, for African American women, for African immigrants. And my second co-author is a Republican. Right? There are places where we can. There's places where we can.
All the doulas in the audience. Big round of applause.
But I think that that's so important, right? That's part of like some of the people that I'm closest to in the legislature. We don't always agree politically, but we can have robust conversations and can find that common ground in those places. With one of my colleagues, we don't agree on reproductive choice. But he's like, I am with you when it comes to figuring out how to provide prenatal care and then making sure that young children and their families have what they need. So let's find those spaces where we can agree and figure out how to move forward. That's not going to get you on the cover of the front page of the Star Tribune, but it matters.
Okay, I promise this gentleman raced out of his seat in order to... Did you write it down even? Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I prepared.
Okay.
So, we touched on your relationship with the NRA before. So I have some specific questions for you. You said you favored waiting periods. Would you support a ban on AR-15 rifles like they have in California? And do you think that a person should be able to sell a gun to their brother without going through an FFL? And I assume you know what an FFL is.
Yes, I do.
But I don't. I don't know a lot of
federal
things.
Firearm license, and this issue of universal background checks. And when you're talking universal background checks, it's the loophole in that you can come and do a gun show and you can sell there, which always seemed very unfair economically to me, that you have people paying taxes and operating a gun store in a town, and they pay taxes, they do the background checks, they do everything else. But if you set up a table at the Armory that you rent for $20, you don't have to. I think people look at that. As far as transferring amongst family, I have 2 shotguns and 1 rifle. One of the shotguns came from my wife's grandfather, and the other one came from her grandfather, who he carried in World War II. It doesn't have it. And on those, I think those things should be able to be in family, or heirlooms should be able to be moved around.
What if it was my hunting buddy?
Well, is your hunting buddy your brother?
Yeah.
What if he's not my brother? What if he has no relation to me?
Yeah, good question.
Then you do a universal background check, I think,
Okay.
on many of these. I think you can do that, and I think most people aren't opposed to doing it. I've always voted, I carried the bill to fully fund this. The problem is these things aren't fully funded, so you end up with loopholes in it where somebody gets approved or doesn't get approved. So I think you can.
I'm going to just say, I mean, like,
So-
are we talking hunting buddies in like a Brokeback Mountain sense, or just a more general, like...
And then I think I would and make the case to your other, and I think this is where folks who want to get at the heart of this need to be very specific on the types of weapons they're talking about, what you're saying. My issue has been on this. If you are too dangerous to own a firearm, I don't think it really matters what kind it is. You are still too dangerous to own that. And when we go into that space of starting to, and don't get me wrong, there's always been limits on this. I was a howitzer candidate. You can't buy a howitzer, nor should you be able to, or whatever it might be. So that there is that. I said I was open to looking at that after the Sandy Hook because I think most of us understand what we saw in Las Vegas is the ability to deliver that much rate of fire equals that many more casualties. Now the question is, how do we talk to those folks who say, you know what? I'm a responsible gunner and I did the background check. I can use these things in a responsible manner. Why am I being pigeonholed? That's the question. And those are the people, what's that?
What do you need that kind of gun for?
Have you asked them? Is what I would ask
I'm
you.
just saying, it's like if it's hunting or
Yes.
that kind of thing, I mean, it
Sport shooting, trap shooting or whatever. This is where it gets into when people say, well, how many guns do you need? And they will respond, I don't know, how many golf clubs do you need? And someone said, well, that's not apples to apples. Yes, and they would say, yes, it is apples to apples because we do it for different things. What my point to you is that as a society, let's all agree on this, that there are people that are too dangerous and should not have their hands on firearms. There are places where firearms should not be in with crowds. There are places and activities that always have regulated that, but you do have a constitutional right to do some of these things. I think if you start from that place, we start having the conversation, and I do think it starts with this universal background check. Your question is specific and will need to be hammered out on this idea of what do you do amongst families, but those are the conversations we can have if we start out with this premise that the vast majority of people, gun owner and non-gun owners, are horrified and tragically heartbroken when someone is killed in a manner like you saw. How do we find the solution to stop that is what we got to bring them together to do. They're not seeing that right now. A large number of responsible gun owners feel like they're being blamed for all these tragedies, when many of them are more than open to the idea of universal background checks and the conversation of what do you do with some of these firearms that are heavy caliber, too many, too rapid a fire. So all those things can be there. But I'm telling you, look what's happened in the country. We're not moving anywhere. We're stagnated in it, and that's the part that's just frustrating to me.
Is this one of these long late night back and forths that you all have?
About through text message of
Or Snapchat or whatever?
Yeah, we're big Snapchatters. I'm like, I'm a kitty, you're a dog. I don't know. But I would say, coming back to this issue, right? 74% of gun owners believe in universal background checks. 92% of Americans overall believe in universal background checks. And damn it, if we're not going to be the ones to do it.
Right.
I think
just do it.
we should just do it. And that's the place to start. I do think it's really important, Tane, that I mention, as you're talking about getting things done in the legislature, I had one of two DFL bills that were brought to the House floor last year that were passed. My bill was the last bill of the session that was passed.
Was it also about doulas?
No, it wasn't about doulas. It was about firefighting commissions. Yay! So I feel pretty good about that.
Dane asked the question of coming to this. I think this is the model we talked about. I think it's healthy to imagine your governor and lieutenant governor are challenging each other on these issues that impact people deeply, that they're challenging each other to find solutions, that they're figuring out together how to build counterintuitive coalitions. I think it's healthy.
So on that actually brings me to my last piece that I wanted to ask, which is, we've had some other candidates for governor, and you mentioned that there's a lot of good people running for governor. So what is the question that people here should be asking of you or of the other candidates for governor in order to try and figure out who they want to vote for?
I think the question is, how are you going to build coalitions to actually get things done?
Yes, I agree with that, but I would say this too, who's going to win to make sure we get it. So I don't want to be crass on this, but you don't get to govern afterwards. We are concerned, and I want to build coalitions to govern afterwards, but I am not interested in going down the road that Wisconsin has gone down, and I feel a sense of urgency that we need to get that done right. So I think the question you should ask them, what's your plan to win in November? What is your plan to stand in front of all that money and $50 million that will come in to paint us as something, all of the ads that will come?
It's already started.
It's already started. How do you stand up to that? So,
on that note, please, a big round of applause. Representative